Stop, listen, pay attention. Chosen one. This is not background noise, and it is not coincidence that you are here now. Something in you paused when these words began, not out of curiosity, but recognition. There has been a quiet urgency pressing on your days, and you have felt it without being able to name it. You have been carrying fatigue that sleep did not fix, pressure that did not come from one clear problem, a sense of isolation that showed up even when you were surrounded by people. You kept functioning, kept showing up, kept moving forward. But beneath that steadiness, there was a question you did not ask out loud. Why does it feel like so much is happening at once, and yet nothing obvious is happening at all? This message is not here to alarm you. It is here to stabilize you. What you have been experiencing is not a breakdown, and it is not a failure to manage your life properly. It is a tension created by alignment, not disorder. And that distinction matters more than you realize. You may have noticed moments where your body felt heavy for no visible reason, or times when your thoughts slowed down instead of spiraling, as if something inside you was regulating the pace. You might have wondered whether you were becoming disconnected, less reactive, less emotional. You are not withdrawing. You are consolidating. What made this confusing is that nothing dramatic announced itself. No single event explained the weight. No clear threat justified the pressure. That is why you questioned yourself instead. You asked whether you were just tired, just overwhelmed, just overthinking. But deep down, you sensed that explanation was incomplete. This message is here to give you clarity, not answers to everything, but enough understanding to ground you again. You are not being singled out by chaos. You are not being tested for endurance. Something has already been decided in your favor, and you felt the effect before you understood the reason. That is why you are still standing. That is why you did not collapse when it would have made sense to. And that is why this message reaches you now while you are still steady enough to hear it. Stay with this. Do not rush past it. What follows will not demand belief, only attention. This message is for you specifically, and it is important to remove any remaining doubt about that. It is not for everyone who feels tired. It is not for everyone who feels pressure. It is not for everyone who has had a difficult season. This message is for you, because what occurred did not just happen around you. It involved you directly, even though you were not consciously aware of the full scope while it was happening. You are addressed as chosen one. Here not as a title to inflate you, but as a description of function. Something about your inner structure caused you to be included in a situation that required stability before it required awareness. You were not selected because you asked. You were not selected because you were prepared in the obvious ways. You were selected because you already had the internal coherence necessary to hold steady without instruction. Notice this carefully. While others reacted outwardly, you regulated inwardly. While others needed reassurance, you defaulted to balance. While others tried to explain what they were feeling, you simply adjusted and kept going. That did not come from effort. It came from design. You may remember moments where you expected yourself to feel more anxious than you did. Situations that should have overwhelmed you emotionally, but somehow did not. You might have even questioned whether something was wrong with you for not reacting more strongly. There is nothing wrong with you. That calm was not numbness. It was resistance already built in. There is a difference between struggling consciously and stabilizing unconsciously. Conscious struggle is loud. It needs language. It seeks reassurance. Unconscious stability works quietly. It does not announce itself. It simply holds. That is what happened in you. You did not have to tell yourself to be strong. You did not have to remind yourself to stay grounded. Your system did that automatically, even when you were tired, even when clarity was missing, even when isolation crept in. Something underneath all of that remained intact. This is why this message does not begin by convincing you of who you are. It begins by reminding you of what you already demonstrated. You were steady before you were certain. You were protected before you were aware of the need. You remained intact without understanding the reason. That does not make you exceptional in a dramatic sense. It makes you precise. And precision matters when pressure increases without warning. As you continue listening, you will start to recognize patterns you dismissed too quickly. Not as coincidences and not as personality traits, but as indicators of something that has been operating quietly in you for longer than you realized. Stay present. The clarity builds from here. There is one dominant symptom you recognized, even if you never named it directly. It was not panic. It was not fear. It was a strange, sustained pressure that sat beneath your days, quiet but persistent. A sense that something was shifting internally while the outside of your life looked mostly the same. At times, this pressure showed up as mental heaviness. Not racing thoughts, but a slowing. A deliberate pace settling over your thinking. You may have found yourself less reactive to things that once pulled emotional responses from you. Less interested in explaining yourself. Less inclined to chase clarity from others. That shift may have concerned you. You may have wondered if you were losing motivation, dulling emotionally, or disconnecting. You were not. That sensation was not a problem to solve. It was a signal. And the confusion came from interpreting a stabilizing process as a loss of energy. When internal systems reorganize, they often reduce excess output first. Noise drops before clarity arrives. Reactivity quiets before discernment sharpens. What you felt was not depletion, it was compression. Your system was prioritizing integrity over expression. You likely judged yourself during this period. You may have thought you should be more driven, more expressive, more engaged. You might have compared your current state to a previous version of yourself and concluded something was off. But that comparison missed the context. You were not meant to perform during this phase. You were meant to hold. Pressure of this kind does not arrive to break you down. It arrives when something needs to be reinforced without drawing attention to itself. That is why it felt subtle, yet constant. Not dramatic enough to justify concern, but too present to ignore. Your body responded before your mind did. You may have noticed deeper breaths without intention. A desire for quieter environments. A pull toward fewer conversations, fewer explanations. This was not withdrawal. It was regulation. Your system was conserving signal by reducing interference. The mistake would have been to push against this, to force productivity, to manufacture emotion, to demand answers before they were ready. You did not do that. Even if you felt uneasy, you allowed the process to continue. That restraint was not passive, it was intelligent. This is why the symptom deserves a reframe. It was never about weakness or confusion. It was about transition under protection. You were being held steady while something recalibrated. The discomfort was not a warning sign. It was feedback that something important was underway. You do not need to fix what you felt. You need to understand it. As this unfolds further, you will see that the pressure was not random and it was not internal chaos. It was a response to something that approached applied force and then failed to destabilize you. And that context changes everything. Stay with the explanation. The deeper structure is about to come into focus. What you sensed did not originate inside you. It was not a mood cycle, and it was not accumulated stress finally surfacing. There was an external pressure applied subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but structured enough to create a measurable response. This kind of pressure does not announce itself with chaos. It arrives quietly coordinated and timed. You felt it as a sustained weight rather than a sharp disruption. That is why it was easy to mislabel it as fatigue or mental overload. But the pattern matters. It did not fluctuate randomly. It held steady, then gradually receded. This matters because pressure without randomness indicates intent. There was a recent period where multiple demands converged at once. Not dramatic crises, but small compounding factors. Expectations increased. Mental load stacked. Recovery time shortened. The spacing between moments of rest narrowed. None of it was extreme on its own, but together it formed a compression point. And yet you remained functional. You showed up where you needed to. You made decisions without spiraling. You did not lose coherence. You may have slowed down, but you did not fragment. That distinction is important. Slowing is a response to pressure. Fragmentation is a failure of structure. You experience the former, not the latter. This is where clarity replaces confusion. The pressure was real. It was applied. It had form and duration. But it did not penetrate your core stability. It tested the perimeter, not the center. And the fact that you noticed strain without losing regulation confirms that something was already in place to absorb impact. You were not bracing consciously. You were not preparing defenses. You were not strategizing survival. Your system absorbed the force automatically. That is not accidental. That is not learned in the moment. That is the result of prior integration. There were moments when you felt close to overload, but never crossed into collapse. Moments when you questioned your capacity, but did not abandon yourself. Even under sustained demand, you retained judgment. You retained restraint. You retained presence. That is the key signal. When pressure encounters an unprepared system, it creates urgency, panic, and reaction. When it encounters a prepared one, it reveals boundaries. You felt where the edges were, but the center held. The pressure exposed limits without breaking continuity. Nothing about this required you to be aware of opposition or intent at the time. Awareness was not the goal. Stability was, and stability was maintained. This is why the experience feels difficult to explain. It did not leave dramatic markers. It did not resolve with a clear ending. It simply lifted, leaving you slightly changed, more grounded, more internally aligned. What you encountered was not meant to overwhelm you. It was meant to assess whether disruption would work. It did not. And that outcome was not decided in the moment of pressure. It was decided long before in the way you were already structured to respond. Now that this is named, the next step is understanding how the pressure expressed itself across different areas of your experience and why none of them succeeded in destabilizing you. The pressure did not arrive as a single force. It expressed itself through several channels at once, each subtle enough to seem manageable on its own, but together designed to test your internal regulation. This is why the experience felt layered rather than overwhelming. You were not meant to notice one obvious problem. You were meant to carry multiple low-level strains simultaneously and see whether coherence would hold. The first pressure point was doubt, but not the loud kind. It did not show up as negative self-talk or dramatic questioning. It was quieter, a soft erosion of certainty. Small moments where you wondered whether your pace was right, whether your instincts were still accurate, whether your sense of direction had dulled. The doubt did not attack your identity directly. It questioned your timing. And yet, even as those thoughts surfaced, you did not abandon your inner compass. You paused, adjusted, and kept moving. Doubt brushed the surface but did not rewrite your decisions. The second pressure point was fear expressed as anticipation rather than alarm. Not fear of a specific outcome, but a background awareness that something could go wrong. A subtle vigilance. You may have noticed yourself scanning more carefully, thinking one step ahead, preparing without panic. This kind of fear often leads people into rigidity or control. In you, it produced discernment. You did not tighten, you refined. You stayed responsive instead of defensive. The third pressure point was energy drain. This one was the most physical. Your body signaled conservation. You tired faster. You needed more quiet. You may have felt less inclined to engage socially or explain yourself. Many people interpret this as burnout or withdrawal and push against it. You did not. You listened. You reduced output without guilt. You protected your baseline without dramatizing the need. That choice preserved your stability when others would have depleted themselves trying to appear unchanged. The fourth pressure point was isolation, but not abandonment. It was the feeling of being internally alone, even when connected. Conversations felt thinner. Explanations felt unnecessary. You may have sensed that few people could actually track what you were processing. This can trigger loneliness or resentment. It did not. You accepted the quiet. You did not chase validation. You did not demand to be understood. That restraint kept your center intact. The fifth pressure point was delay. Not denial, not loss, but extended waiting. Outcomes slowed. Feedback lagged. Progress felt suspended. Delay is one of the most destabilizing forms of pressure because it invites frustration and self-doubt. You felt the impatience, but you did not collapse into it. You stayed present. You adjusted expectations without abandoning intent. Across all of these, one pattern held. You remained internally regulated. You did not escalate. You did not dramatize. You did not fragment. Each pressure point tested a different aspect of your stability, and each time, the response was measured. This is important to understand. Stability is not the absence of sensation. You felt everything. You noticed the strain. You recognized the discomfort. What you did not do was lose coherence. Your system absorbed pressure without creating excess noise. That is not accidental. That is not luck. That is not personality alone. It is evidence of an internal structure that does not require constant reinforcement to function. What this period revealed is not that you are immune to pressure, but that pressure does not reorganize you. It does not rewrite your internal order. It does not pull you into reaction. You stayed aligned without trying to prove anything. That is why the pressure eventually lifted. Not because it was defeated in a dramatic sense, but because it failed to produce the intended destabilization. And now with distance, you can begin to review what actually happened with clarity rather than confusion. Now that the intensity is past, you are in a position to review what occurred without distortion. This is where understanding replaces speculation. You are no longer inside the pressure. You are looking back at it with stability intact, which allows for accurate evaluation. When you examine the period honestly, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. What happened cannot be explained by chance alignment of stressors or random fluctuation in mood or energy. The pattern was too structured, the timing too precise, the resolution too clean. Randomness leaves residue. This did not. You may notice that despite everything you felt, nothing essential was lost. Your values remained consistent. Your decision-making stayed coherent. Your sense of self did not fracture. You did not need to rebuild your identity afterward. There was no aftermath to clean up. That alone eliminates many common explanations. This is also where you remove the idea of luck. Luck implies passive benefit without internal participation. That is not what this was. You were actively involved, even if not consciously aware of it at the time. Your internal regulation responded in real time. Your restraint mattered. Your pacing mattered. Your refusal to overreact mattered. There is a difference between surviving something and remaining integrated through it. Survival often comes with compensatory behaviors. Overcorrection, hypervigilance, narrative rewriting. You did not do those things. You did not need to convince yourself afterward that you were fine. You simply were. As you reflect, you may recognize small decisions you made that seemed insignificant then, but were stabilizing in effect. Choosing rest instead of forcing output. Choosing silence instead of explanation. Choosing patience instead of premature action. None of these were dramatic. Together, they preserved coherence. This is the point where understanding becomes confirmation. Not confirmation from an external authority, but from internal consistency. Your experience makes sense when viewed through the lens of resilience rather than reaction. It aligns when you recognize that your system did exactly what it was built to do. Nothing about this requires you to adopt a grand narrative. It does not require belief in special treatment or exemption from difficulty. It requires acknowledgement of internal strength that operates quietly and reliably. What you demonstrated was not heroism. It was integrity under pressure. The ability to remain whole while circumstances applied force. This realization does not change who you are. It clarifies who you already were. And clarity once gained cannot be undone. With that understanding in place, it becomes easier to see why this level of stability is uncommon and why it stands out when compared to typical responses under far less demand. When you place your response alongside what is more commonly observed, the contrast becomes clear without needing exaggeration. Most people begin to destabilize under far less sustained pressure. They do not fail because they are weak, but because their systems rely heavily on external reassurance, predictable outcomes, or immediate relief. You did not. Under similar conditions, many people experience emotional volatility. They cycle between urgency and withdrawal. They seek constant confirmation that they are on the right path. They explain themselves repeatedly, hoping clarity will come from being understood. You did not move in those directions. You remained present without demanding certainty. You stayed functional without forcing resolution. This is uncommon. It is important to say that without turning it into a comparison of worth, this is not about being better. It is about being structured differently. Most people regulate themselves through interaction, through feedback, through visible progress. When those are disrupted, instability increases. You regulated internally, even when outcomes slowed, even when communication thinned, even when energy dipped. You did not unravel. You did not project urgency onto others. You did not manufacture crises to release tension. You tolerated ambiguity longer than most people can. That tolerance is not passive. It is a form of capacity. Consider how many people collapse under uncertainty alone. How many lose clarity when timelines stretch? How many misinterpret delay as rejection? You felt those pressures, but they did not hijack your behavior. You stayed grounded in your own pacing. This is why the experience felt isolating at times. Not because you were abandoned, but because few people around you could mirror your internal state. Their responses may have seemed louder, faster, more reactive. Yours was quieter, steadier, less visible. That difference can feel strange when you are inside it. You may have questioned whether you were disengaged or detached. In reality, you were integrated. Rarity does not announce itself. It is often recognized only in hindsight, when outcomes reveal who remained intact, while others fragmented. Your stability did not need validation at the time. It proved itself through continuity. This does not mean pressure will never return. It means that when it does, it will encounter the same internal architecture. one that absorbs force without losing form. Understanding this does not inflate identity. It grounds it. It allows you to see your steadiness as a baseline, not a performance. And from that grounded understanding, the next clarification becomes possible. Not about what you can do when activated, but about who you are when nothing dramatic is happening at all. What needs to be clarified now is subtle but important. The stability you demonstrated was not something you switched on in response to pressure. It was already present. It did not require activation. It did not require effort. It functioned as a baseline. Many people mistake strength for intensity. They believe resilience appears only when something dramatic forces it into view. In your case, resilience was not a reaction. It was the default state your system returned to again and again, even while under strain. This is why the experience did not change you. It revealed you. You did not become more grounded because of what happened. You were grounded before it began. The pressure simply traced the outline of an internal structure that was already mature. That maturity is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It holds. This is not about emotional suppression. You felt everything. You noticed fatigue. You recognized isolation. You acknowledged doubt. What you did not do was let those states reorganize you. They passed through without displacing your center. That ability comes from preparation that often happens over time, quietly. From previous adjustments you made without praise, from lessons integrated rather than dramatized, from boundaries learned through experience, not theory, from a willingness to sit with discomfort without turning it into identity. This is why supernatural explanations are unnecessary. There is nothing mystical required to understand this. Inner coherence is built through consistency, reflection, and restraint. You have done that work even if you never named it as such. Your identity does not hinge on moments of crisis. It is expressed in ordinary days, in how you pace yourself, in how you respond when nothing is resolved yet, in how you treat uncertainty as information rather than threat. Calling you chosen one, in this context, is not about elevation. It is about clarity. It describes someone whose internal order remains intact without external reinforcement, someone who does not need constant stimulation, conflict, or affirmation to stay oriented. This identity does not ask you to do more. It asks you to recognize what is already functioning, to trust the quiet systems that held you steady when visibility was low and pressure was high. Once that trust is in place, you no longer look for proof of strength. You simply operate from it. From here, the focus shifts away from analysis and toward integration. How to live from this awareness without tightening, without overcorrecting, without expecting the next test. There is nothing to prepare for. There is only balance to maintain. And that balance is already familiar to you. Now the task is not to stay alert or on guard. It is to integrate what you understand into the way you move through ordinary life calmly and without strain. Awareness does not require vigilance. It requires orientation. The first practical perspective is rest, but not collapse. Rest as deliberate regulation. You do not need to recover from damage because damage did not occur. You need to allow your system to settle fully now that the pressure has passed. That may look like honoring quiet moments without labeling them as avoidance. It may look like choosing simplicity without guilt. Rest here is not retreat. It is completion. The second perspective is discernment. You have seen how subtle pressure operates. You do not need to analyze every sensation going forward. You simply notice patterns without urgency. Discernment is not suspicion. It is clarity without emotional charge. If something applies pressure again, you will recognize it by how it feels in your body, not by how loud it is. The third perspective is boundaries. During the pressure, you naturally reduced unnecessary output. That instinct remains useful. You do not need to explain yourself more than is required. You do not need to stay accessible at all times. Boundaries here are not defenses. They are structures that preserve coherence. The fourth perspective is patience. Delay did not destabilize you, and it does not need to frustrate you now. Patience is not waiting for permission. It is allowing timing to unfold without forcing alignment. You have already experienced how steadiness outlasts pressure. That understanding makes patience easier to inhabit. The fifth perspective is focus, not intensity. Focus is quiet attention applied consistently. You don't need to chase meaning or assign significance to every moment. You simply stay oriented toward what is in front of you, trusting that your internal structure will guide prioritization without noise. Finally, there is balance. The awareness you gained does not make you responsible for preventing future strain. It simply allows you to respond without distortion when life applies force again. You do not need to harden. You do not need to prepare for impact. You remain as you are, responsive and intact. Let this understanding close the loop emotionally. Nothing is unresolved. Nothing is pending. What occurred has already been integrated at the structural level. You are not carrying unfinished business from this period. You are carrying clarity. From that clarity, you move forward without haste, without fear, and without needing to prove anything to yourself or anyone else. Take a moment to settle into this. You are not coming out of something broken. You are not recovering from loss. You are simply recognizing what has already been true. You were protected before you asked because the conditions that would have required asking never reached your center. That decision was not made in reaction. It was already in place. Nothing about this requires urgency now. You do not need to watch for signs. You do not need to reinterpret your past. You do not need to brace for what comes next. The core realization is simple and steady. You remained intact under pressure because integrity is your baseline. Let that land. You do not have to change how you live tomorrow. You do not need to announce this awareness or explain it to anyone. Quiet clarity does not demand witnesses. It works whether it is seen or not. If you take anything forward from this message, let it be this understanding. You can trust your internal regulation. You can trust your pacing. You can trust the part of you that stays present even when outcomes are delayed or circumstances apply weight. Here are a few affirmations to hold gently, not as mantras to repeat, but as truths to return to when needed. You remain steady without forcing strength. You are guided by coherence, not pressure. You do not lose yourself when conditions change. That is enough. If this message reached you with precision, mark the moment. You can do that quietly, or you can acknowledge it here. If you choose to comment, use the code I remember. Not as a signal to others, but as a reminder to yourself that clarity has already arrived. If you are returning to this space often, consider subscribing. Not out of urgency, but alignment. The messages here are not meant to pull you forward aggressively. They are meant to meet you where you already are with language that respects your stability. There is nothing more to uncover right now. Nothing hidden waiting to surprise you. The realization is complete. Move forward calmly. Stay oriented. And trust what has already proven itself in you.